My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, a zine set that demands addressing, 1,000 Islands.
Our first segment is a basic crawl.
1,000 Islands is a set of zines written by Zirexio with illustrations by Munkau. In the introduction to the Drawings Part 1 zine, Munkau writes this, which describes the project as a whole. Guns, knives, ships, textiles, magic, gods. 1,000 Islands is a Southeast Asian fantasy world-building project. This project tries to 1. Shift the centre of fantasy away from an Anglo-European setting. 2. Move away from the depictions shaped by contemporary ethno-nationalism. And 3. Explore the magic and myth of Southeast Asia and have fun with it. In short, 1,000 Islands is a project of researching and asking what is SEA fantasy and fiction and how to visualize it.
The first zine in the collection is called Murkurgur, the Death-Rolled Kingdom. Riches clog Murkurgur's rivers, but its citizens build nothing from stone. The crocodiles say so. The crocodiles rule here. What stone cities exist in Murkurgur are overgrown ruins, haunted by corpse honey hosts, mosquito witches, gods trapped in the prison of their idols. These old cities are prescribed too. It doesn't stop Downlander expeditions, though. Old cities are always full of treasure.
Zine number 2 is Kraching, the Place of the Poor. In Kraching, woodworking is revered. The surrounding forests are full of haunted timber, longing to be carved into masks and figurines. They want to see the world. In Kraching, cats are revered. Scions of the god Owl, they are welcomed as equal members of any household. They hunt game and lend magic.
Zine 3 is Upper Heleng, the forest beloved by time. This is the one with the magical forest. Quote, the leeches here do not take blood, they take other things. A year of your life, a love you know. Upper Heleng is an adventure setting inspired by forest taboos and Batek egalitarianism. This one includes an A3 die drop table for navigating the shifting landscape of the forest.
And Zine 4 is Anjang, the Queen on Dog Mountain. In every fold of Dog Mountain there is a village, green with terraced rice. The farmers smile at you. They always harvest bumper crops. They all look a little thin, though. The farmers bow low at a passing palanquin. It is a prince of the royal family. He wears a high hat. He smiles at you, also. A predatory grin from a mouth of sharp fangs.
The collection also contains 2 zines that are drawings full of various illustrations of people, places, and creatures. So, how have we used 1,000 Islands, Tom?
Right, so let's see. I have used all 4 of them in different ways. I used Murkurgur as a one-shot. That was in Holmes D&D first edition. Kraching, another one-shot. This one using Troika. Anjang, that session was, I think, D&D 1E again, although I've now lost my notes, so I'm not too sure about that. Definitely happened, though, because I remember the palace map getting used a lot. And finally, Upper Heleng, I ran as a one-on-one game with my son, who is 5, of Into the Odd. And that was over a number of short sessions, which I would say added up to 2 grown-up sessions, probably, in total. Yeah.
Nice.
How about you?
I've only used one of them, Kraching. I wrote and ran a one-shot of Trophy Gold using Kraching. So, things we like about 1,000 Islands. Let's just start with some top-level stuff. I think the illustrations are a real highlight here. They are very detailed, and I think this is one of those rare instances where, in role-playing game books at least, where the artwork sort of has equal billing with the text. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's true. If I recall correctly, and don't quote me on this or record me in a podcast, but I think the illustrations actually came first.
Okay.
So Munkau did the pictures, and then Zidek kind of wrote to fill in the gaps. That sounds a little derogatory, but you know what I mean? He kind of described what's in it. And you're right, it's very interesting. It's easily... Yeah, it's 50-50 text and pictures, isn't it? The illustrations themselves are in this very detailed, black and white, line illustration style. It reminds me of the artist who did a lot of fighting fantasy and 80s Games Workshop things. Oh, Russ Nicholson. That kind of hyper-detailed but quite flat-looking mass scenes.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's definitely a good observation. Why don't we talk a little bit about the actual just setting and the content here? Because I think, so those goals that you read aloud in the first part of what Munkau and Zedek were trying to accomplish, I think they really stuck the landing.
Yeah.
I mean, being like super well versed in Southeast Asian culture, I still feel like they stuck the landing. Like, this just feels incredibly fresh to me. What do you think?
I do. It's very hard to articulate well, but I mean, when I look at this, when I read it, indeed when I play it, it really feels to me a lot like being in Malaysia or Indonesia, which are the two bits of Southeast Asia that I've the most experience of. Java is where I've been more often than anywhere else. And yeah, it's a fantasy world, but it does have the right feelings to it for it to be a fantasy world that's based upon that. And maybe it's that it relates to quite common experiences you have there, like mosquito witches. Mosquitoes are a thing. That's a little trite, though, as an observation on my part. I think maybe the illustrations go a long way. The ways that characters relate to each other feel very... If it's meaningful to describe Southeast Asia as having a common thread like that, then they do. But you don't have to take my word for it, because I did some science in preparation for this episode, which is, I took the drawings zine. Unfortunately, I only have the first of the two, but I took it, I concealed the introduction, which explains the plan, and I just showed it to an Indonesian, my wife, and said, like, hey, if you thought this was based on somewhere in the real world, where would you think it was? And she said straight off, probably Indonesia. And I kind of tried to press her for why she thought that, and she reckons largely the clothing styles.
Okay.
And the weapons, interestingly, she called out. So that seems to be the two key things she noticed. But I think it's worth mentioning, if you want a guide to the clothing styles, habits and culture of Indonesia, this is not the book for you, because it's not that. It just kind of draws on that in the same way that if you looked at a D&D source book and tried to use it as a historical reference point for medieval Europe,
right, yeah,
you might get away with it, but so in that sense, certainly I don't think there's any way you can argue that they failed in that initial set of goals that they set for themselves.
Yeah, it feels like simultaneously very authentic to a particular point of view and perspective and culture. Not authentic to a culture, but like authentic to a sort of spirit of culture, I suppose is the word I'm looking for. That's maybe a weird way of putting it. While at the same time feeling very fresh. Like, I know enough about Southeast Asia to know that this is a melange or a pastiche of ideas. Like you said, it's not like a historical representation of the region. It just feels really good, feels really fresh. And in play, it does as well. I think we're going to talk about this a little bit more later, but this collection of zines, it's a bold approach. And this is what I mean by that. I think that it takes a lot of nerve to put out a product in the current tabletop role-playing game landscape that has such a light touch when it comes to the text. This is a very, very short text overall. All 4 zines, I read them, or the 3 that I hadn't read before, I read them in 30 minutes. Like, it didn't take long.
Yeah.
That's not to diminish it at all. I actually like that about it. It's a bold presentation because it has a certain power and quality to it. On a surface level, it feels a little bit like a picture book, which makes a lot more sense now, since you told me that to some degree Zedek was responding to Munkau's pictures. But also, there's a poetry to it. It feels a little bit like literature. There's a beautiful economy of language in these scenes. And I have an example that I want to kind of use to interrogate the idea of the economy of language, if you will.
Sure.
So in Murkergur, there's a merchant lord named Mahanat Son Orm. And this is all we know about them. Quote, owns the godowns and the stevedores, lives in a bungalow on the nose, will fence the artifacts you find if he trusts you, reedy voice. Ha, look, I don't know you, but I could. Ask me how. Mahanat's local laborers are refusing to work. Ingrates. 1 brass piece a month, that's a fair wage. Deal with them, and I'll deal with you. Recently discovered that the nostrils under his bungalow are not just for show, but actual passages. Where do they lead? What treasures did the giant statue swallow? This is densely packed with story possibilities.
Yeah.
You have this character just on the surface level. Like, you learn a lot about him. He's kind of a miser. His little quote has a built-in quest, right? He's a quest giver. Help him deal with his ingrate workers and he'll pay you. And then in 2 sentences, we have like this possibility of a dungeon beneath his bungalow. There's not a lot of detail here, but there's an incredible amount of possibility. And this economy of language and presentation is so powerful throughout the whole collection. I really, really liked it.
Yeah, that's right. I was trying to figure out how to say this, but you're right, and to identify the possibility. It's possibility dense, all this text. It doesn't have lots of utility in the same way that, for example, in the previous episode we talked about Winter's Daughter and its dungeon descriptions, which are terse and get the point across and are very concrete. But what it does have is just all this promise, which can be taken in a lot of different ways. You'll be pleased to know, I hope, stroke guess, that in the game I ran, this exact quest hook came up.
Nice.
And the PCs seized it by going and telling the striking workers what was up and teaming up with them to steal his boats and use them to go upriver to find treasure. So,
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, well, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but that idea of like possibilities is super important because I wrote an incursion for Trophy Gold, a one-shot incursion, just using the hints of what was going on in Kraching. You have to do a little bit of work, I think, as a GM, but gosh, it's an amazing playground that's been laid out here, and I think it's worth exploring and getting into.
Yeah, it is.
I want to say one other thing, too. Mm-hmm. Kind of going back to when we were talking about, like, this feels like a really fresh take on fantasy, at least compared to what we've been accustomed to. I want to note here that it still feels very OSR, even though it has ditched most of the tropes of OSR fantasy, the trappings at least. Example, there's a trade good in one of the books, I can't remember which one, called Teak Semen, and quote, "It's only produced through ritual intercourse. Basically, a shaman must fuck a suitable tree. After climax, its trunk oozes a fatty sap, sets into teardrop shapes like candies. Any woman who swallows one will become pregnant with a teak nymph." That is so OSR, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
full OSR.
Like, I don't know why it's OSR. It's kind of one of those, it's like one of those, you know it when you see it kind of things, but it is like, it just has this winking, slightly gross, slightly, fuck it, I just want to do whatever crazy thing like pops out of my mind. I'm going to put that on the page. Quite a quality to it, and I'm really into it.
Yeah. And of course, like, more broadly, there are quests to be had. There's sort of dungeon delves, stroke tomb robbing, and there's random tables. There's like that random, is it the haunted idols in Murkogur, which are trapped gods, and you generate a random number
idols,
of faces for them, and the faces all have different random. Oh man, that's really cool. Especially if you do it at the table as the thing crashes out of the forest towards the player characters. It's very OSR, and I worry, stroke wonder if people look at the aesthetic of the zines if they're running an OSR game and think, oh, that won't work for my game framework, but it will. It definitely will.
It will. Yeah, it totally will. So, and I know that from experience. So, Okay, anything else you want to say that appealed to you?
Yeah, actually, there's a couple of things. The sort of the high level thing is that I enjoyed how the zines, in general, I think particularly the one I noticed is in Kratching, which is they kind of avoid pinning down fixed taxonomies of monsters or cosmology or what have you. So if you look at there's a recurring thing in Kratching, the cat-based one, where it describes the spirit stroke deity stroke magic cat, Ao, who's the patron of various things. And these legends sort of, but maybe don't quite contradict each other, which in some respects does resemble, real life mythology. There's lots of we get fed a bit of a pat version of Greek myths when we're growing up in the West, but in fact, if you look at the original things, there are contradictory versions that literally could not coexist. You have to just decide which version of Artemis you're going with. We sort of learn terms for creatures across Southeast Asia, for example, like the Pontianak is a kind of ghost stroke demon monster that varies a lot, like from place to place, or that you'll hear the term swangy, which is another sort of haunting spirit that... Actually, I shouldn't talk too much about them, because one of the versions of the swangy is that if you talk about them, they'll know and they'll come and find you. But like that aspect only exists on one particular place in Indonesia, and other places don't have that. And so that's kind of reflected in the way that creatures are depicted here in the zines, which is all to the good. And I think part of what makes it feel authentically SEA. And then there's like a minor thing I'd like to point out, which I think is really great in the fourth one, Anjang, which is, you mentioned this idea of it being a bold move to produce a zine like this. Anjang does something which is really cool. And so this is a spoiler alert, I think.
It's big, huge spoiler alert, listeners.
So the picture on the front of this zine is a dog. Okay, it's called Dog Mountain. But it's pretty clear as soon as you get reading it that this is not dog-based. The nobles that live here, they take a blood tithe, a literal blood tithe from their subjects. There's something vampiric about it. You get a few hints. But it's not until the very last page of the zine that you get the reveal of what these nobles really are, which is they're spiders who have complete human bodies instead of faces, effectively, like the spider lives on the back. Yeah. And it doesn't even say that in the text. It shows you a picture of the queen being tended by her handmaidens, and it never directly says spiders. It's just...
Right, yeah.
Now,
it's I great. It's a good moment.
Yeah. I flipped the page and I just had this moment of slow realization of what I'd been reading all the way through. And then you flip back and you see the illustrations again. You see the little legs on the heads and stuff. And oh man, it's really good. And I will say, I think it only just sneaks under the wire of being like, if this zine was any longer and they waited for that moment, it would be very annoying. Right. But this one, they just hits that sweet spot. Is really good, really brave designing, you know?
So questions we had about these zines, our questions are kind of the same. So why don't we just each read off our questions and then discuss? How about that?
Yeah, okay. So my question was, what system or setup did you use, and how did it interact with the adventure that you used, which is at Crushing, right? Because I ran that particular one using Troika, and I'm not sure they were complementary flavors. Like, it felt exactly like Troika. I don't know how much it felt to the players like Thousand Islands. So that was sort of my concern about it.
My question is very similar to you, which is, how did you make these zines work in your chosen system, as there are no identifiable mechanics in the text apart from just occasionally rolling on tables? Like, how did you handle encounters, say? So why don't we discuss these, what I think are basically the same question, ultimately. Mm-hmm. How did we convert and how did we adapt to our system? How do we make it work for our system? To answer your question, I've already alluded to it, but I basically wrote a short incursion. It was just 3 sets for Trophy Gold, and 3 sets is about right for 1 session. And I used, it's one of my chain lightnings actually, but in Crutching there are these 2 like little ginger tabbies that we're told are secretly assassins. And they just and they just returned from the village having like murdered a prince. And I basically made like a little mystery inspired by those 2 tabby cats, wherein the characters had to find out, where do the tabby cats go? So it seems like a very like weird sort of like low stakes fetch quest in the beginning, but then as they continue on, they learn more about the fact that these cats are like people, that they are assassins, that they belong to this particular order of cat assassins. You know, I filled out the sets with details from the book and for the moments and things like that, and statted out some monsters that they were going to run into. It was fairly easy to do, to be honest. I mean, it worked especially good for Trophy Gold because a Trophy Gold incursion is so mechanics light, right? There's almost no hard mechanics in them. They are almost entirely dedicated to theme and details and visuals and descriptions. That was not hard at all. It was actually quite easy to do. I think I knocked it out in an hour. But I had to create kind of like a structure of a story because it's not in Crutching. Like, there's elements there and there's inspiration there. Like we said earlier, there's a lot of possibility there, but you have to kind of like create a thing around it.
Yeah, well, I think maybe you do have to do that for Trophy because it has that whole sets thing going on. You have to at least have in mind what what you'd spend your tokens on to discover, what's the 3-point spend and so on.
Yeah.
For, Troika at D&D, that was not really necessary because each zine begins with the narrative of you crossing the threshold into this area, which is quite far from wherever it was you started. After that, it kind of functions like a point crawl from page to page. So, I just presented, I would just pick like the first encounter that's given. And then, saying improvised, it sounds like a bit grand. I was basically just flipping to whichever thing seemed interesting next that matched what the players were doing. They'd ask, they'd ask around, and then, people would point them towards a certain NPC or to a certain place. Then mechanically, it's fairly straightforward. And I hadn't really realized this until you asked this question, but there's not a lot of different kinds of armor and equipment being worn, and most of the people you meet are pretty ordinary humans or cats, so you don't need to have that many stats on hand to make the encounters go. You just sort of need to think about if someone is a crocodile or a vampire, then you need to consider like some special abilities they may have. But generally speaking, it's first edition D&D is D6 for a sword, and everybody's armor class 10 or 9. Yeah, that's a good point. I think if it were something where the setting were more focused on bits and pieces like that, like who's carrying a shield or not, then it would have been problematic. Or if there were a lot of magic spells that interacted mechanically with people's characteristics, it would be a problem. But all of the things in here do things like making you pregnant with a teak nymph, which is not something that you need to know about, your skill or stamina for Troika or your hit points.
There's no mechanical heft to that, right?
There probably will be at some point, presumably. Of course, I did a one-shot, so I think while there were things that we did that would have had knock-on effects later on, we didn't have to deal with them right at that very moment. So I guess you would have to deal with things post-facto mechanics. So you would establish something has changed, and you'd figure out between sessions what that would mean later on, I suppose. Yeah.
That's great. Let's go to the Chain Lightning round. From Anjang, we have the rattan puppet, made by weaving together spirit stuff and palm wood, with the final spell said, "A fruit buds from the top of its head. Whoever eats this fruit, the puppet obeys. It only takes simple commands, not quick or deft, but tires as a tree does, which is never."
From Murkurgur, Kavala is a serial killer. He kills crocodiles. No special powers, just craft and skill. Even in a land of predators, his work is getting noticed.
I love the illustration of the bee, which is one of the gods in Upper Heleng. It is so disturbing. Also, the moth is very disturbing. Just some really disturbing illustrations, but they're great.
Yeah. Although, turns out 5-year-old children, not that bothered by the moth. They're just, hello, Mr. Moth. Whatever. Okay, my second one. I love the recurring intro formula on the first page of each of the zines, which is good to read to your players to start the session. 5 days by boat upriver. 5 days on foot westwards. 5 days through foggy uplands. 3 days up a switchbacking track.
I mentioned them earlier, but Jyoti and Jovin, darlings of Kraching. They are pale ginger tabbies. Everybody who sees them stops and fawns. "Oh, Jyoti, Jovin, where have you been?" The pair went missing for a month. Agents of the retractable claw, back from murdering a Bambung prince.
One of the palace atmosphere encounters from Anjang. A child. Open eye tattoo on their forehead. Ask them about it. The eye shuts. They bawl.
Let's go to the expert delve. It's the expert delve since A Thousand Islands has such a focus on beautiful pictures and illustrations. Today we are talking about using images and illustrations in our games, both on and offline, practical uses for such things. And Tom, you have copious notes here on our Google Doc, so why don't you just dive right in?
Many of these will seem childishly straightforward, but it feels good to just kind of, do a stream of consciousness and then put bullet points in the middle of it. So here we go. So let's begin with online gaming. Things I have found useful to do include creating an image board, which is, you can have a shared space like a shared Google Sheets is actually quite good for dropping things onto.
Mm-hmm.
Or I've been using Miro recently. Any kind of whiteboard that you can put images on and label them. Good not only for designated portraits for NPCs or PCs or scenes, but as a general mood board, as they say in the fashion trade. You can share a pool of illustrations and imagery and kind of have it there from the beginning of your game, and then pick from it when you need an image that represents something that's happened in the game. So it's been there kind of creating a mood the whole time, but when you need something from it, you kind of assign it to, this NPC, this is their picture. So, for example, at the moment, I'm running a weekly game of late 90s Canadian post-apocalyptic fantasy game, Tribe 8, and I grabbed loads and loads of the portraits of characters that are found in the books for that and stuck them on the Miro board. So they are pictures of people who are kind of understood between us as a group, that they're just around the settlement of the exiles where the PCs live. So in a way, they're people that both the characters and the players recognize by sight. And then when a named NPC kind of crops up significantly in the game, we grab one of them, and that's who they are. That's who they've been the whole time.
Mood boards, taking me back to my days as a buyer for Pier 1 ages ago. Pier 1 now closing, by the way. No more. They're totally out of business because of the pandemic. Kind of sad. Yes, image boards, very important. I think this is probably the main and only way that I use images online. I like to, especially for games that have lots of NPCs, like for Urban Shadows, say, it's really helpful to have like a bunch of pictures ready to go for NPCs that you can just kind of, to sort of short circuit everyone's theater of the mind, right? Just to kind of get straight to the point of like, okay, this is what I think the character looks like. And I think that image boards can also function really well as a sort of post-game ritual. So I used to play with Garrett Reininghaus, and Garrett used to, post-game, he would take all the images that we had, stuck on the character keeper to represent our characters, or that I had stuck on the Google Sheet for the NPCs or whatever. He'd take all these images and he would like just make these beautiful collages of all the characters, write in like names and like notes and like song titles and like all kinds of crazy stuff, just to sort of like create this like artifact for the game. And it was a great way of using it and sort of reinforcing everything that we just did and kind of getting us ready for the next session. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I can't believe this wasn't in my notes. You've reminded me. We've now finished the Enemy Within campaign for Warhammer. And after each of the individual scenarios, one of the players, Paul C., had been doing this thing where he'd make an image collage consisting of like what I played, which is just the cover of the adventure, what I expected, which would be 4 or 5 images representing what he thought would happen before, and then what I got, which is always an absolutely insane collage of mixing illustrations from the adventure and just like film stills or cartoons, and oh man, it's quite something. Not as frequent as Garrett's though, so I guess his work rate a little bit lacking, but yeah, still very good. Yeah, that reminds me actually. Yeah, so group collaborative contributions is something that's very good about this kind of thing. And it's also good to just, like while you're playing online, drop links to images or sometimes videos into the chat of your platform with a quick note explaining why, to just kind of share your different theatres of the mind. So like last weekend I was playing the Chained Coffin for DCC, and we went to the house of this guy who's not a wizard but is a wise man, and it was described as sort of rickety and supported by beams in different ways. And we sort of, the players who were at moments when we were not the active person having a conversation with the non-wizard would drop like little images that we'd recalled and found on the internet, like going, oh, this is what I think his house looks like, and it made me think of this. And that's like that's a fun thing to do. Although obviously do pay attention to the scene, like don't just
right. Yeah. I have had players in the past who spend a lot of time looking up images on their phone while we're playing, and I used to hate that, but I've actually kind of like gotten over it in recent years, because I realize now that that's just a way of like, it helps some people focus to have like little things to like do like that, at the table. Okay, so what else about online things do you want to talk about here?
My last online one is a thing I think we've mentioned before, but I want to include it again here, which is a trick I learned from Todd Foley, creator of a number of role-playing games. He has this sort of talking portrait trick that he does on... now, this mainly works on Hangouts. So what you do is you share screen, and the screen you share is a picture of the NPC that is talking. And what that means is whenever you speak, the picture that pops up for everyone is a picture of that character. And it's very useful for characters who look very different from you in person, like where there would be a big disconnect between what you actually look like and this person. And also just for games with lots of NPCs, actually. It's also useful for that, so they can remember who they're talking to. It works really well like that on Hangouts. On Zoom or Roll20, I think, because screen sharing doesn't work the same way, I think you would have to replace your avatar and turn off your video, so maybe not as smooth or easy to manage. But I think worth a shot, like especially if you're doing one of those scenarios where, you know, you have to go to a grand ball and talk to all the nobles and find out about things. It's probably a better way to keep track than people having to tab out to the NPC portrait gallery and remember which one is talking now.
Okay, well, so let's talk about the use of illustrations offline. So I will say that this is not my area of expertise so much. I don't do this very often, using pictures at the table. I think it mostly comes down to laziness, and that's the true answer. The fake answer is I'm so good at describing things. They don't need pictures; they can totally picture it in their mind. In fact, I'm just kind of lazy about it. But I mean, I'll occasionally spin the iPad around and show like a particular picture that I think is cool or whatever. But I don't have any like particular procedures here so much in offline play. But I know you do. So tell us about it.
Yeah, and in fairness, I think that I tend to only do it when I have the resources available. Like, for example, the Thousand Islands, which are these A5 zines that you can easily just open to the right page and hand to people. Or even, I found, hang on, let me try and recreate this while I record. Yeah, when you're reading the intro, you can, and Jason can see this on the monitor, but you can't. So the illustration of the landscape, if you fold it around to show it to the players, you can read the description off the back of the zine.
Oh,
so it's
nice.
Very functional. So that is what sort of got me, I think it was literally Thousand Islands that got me into using more pictures in real life at the table, which I had not done that much. So let's rattle through the options. There's the standard, you meet a guy and he looks like this, and you hold up a picture. That is pretty simple. In Thousand Islands, actually, the little menus of trade goods that you can buy in each place does the same thing for products and materials in a way that you don't see very often. There's a subtype to this, which is the mission briefing, where you hand out images to people and give them a bit of the Mission Impossible, Good morning, Mr. Phelps, the man you're looking at is blah, 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 which is always fun because people like props and they can hand them round to each other, which is good.
I've been a player in games like that, and it is fun.
Yeah. And then sort of related to that is what I'm going to call the food for thought picture. So, to take an example from Murkugur again, there is a picture of Murkusinga, the port, and it's a huge scene of, there must be dozens of figures in this picture, and houses and boats, trade being done, people talking, and it's too much to take in one glance. But you can hand it to the group, give them something like that, or the Anjang Palace map, which is a kind of 3/4 perspective drawing of all the buildings, and give it to them to look at. So it creates a concrete shared location within the game, and it gives non-active players something to ponder and talk about at the table. Although I will say, if it's inside a zine that you also need to read to run the adventure, print out the pages that you're going to hand out. So like I would print out the pages with the trade goods on and just hand that out and say, when you go to the market, this is what you find. That kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. I love all of that. I want to add in one thing that actually works kind of online or offline. It's more of a specific note for specific kind of genres of play, which is mystery games. Now, we've talked about how using images to define NPCs is very helpful and kind of showing what they look like, and that is true. But in mystery games, there's a real practical application here, which is sometimes it's easier for the players to keep their sleuthing organized if they have pictures of the suspects. Like if they have pictures of the characters who are critical to the mystery. It's a good way of kind of organizing their thinking on the mystery. I like this idea so much, in fact, that my own game, Brindlewood Bay, wherein the mysteries have lists of suspects, next year when I inevitably kickstart a physical version of Brindlewood Bay, we're going to have like cards, like a pack of cards, and the cards are just going to be illustrations of the suspects from the various mysteries so that you can have them laid out on the table, thereby making your mystery theorizing easier. So it's just another good, like a very like kind of specific practical use of images at the table, I think.
Yeah, it is, because I mean, there's a reason why a lot of classic mystery novels have the list of characters in the front of the book and a description of who they are. Because it seems like it's a spoiler, but if you think about it, it's really not. You know, it's a spoiler for a few seconds.
It's so you can keep up as the reader, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I found that works really well. And you do sometimes get a bit of a break in play where someone goes, oh, well, they've got an illustration, so they must be important. But, you know, ultimately, that's fine.
Right, yeah. Okay, well, so anything else you want to say about images and illustrations?
Oh yeah, for offline. Actually, I guess these both work off and online. Which is that choosing portraits during, especially for games where you've got pre-generated characters, I think is quite a good way of customizing. So you're handing out the sheets, they're playing, the fighter, the thief, whatever. But then they pick the picture from a bunch that you've brought and scattered across the table. And again, that's a kind of fun icebreaky way to do it, and it's a way of personalizing your character in a way that is actually, I think, especially for one shots, which I run a lot, it's tough to think on your feet as like, and you end up with like, yeah, well, I guess I'm like a fighter who wears a helmet and I'm big, and it's sort of. But if you can just choose a photo or a picture and go, yeah, that's me, that's my character, it's really nice, and it helps you to identify with your character pretty quickly, I think, as well.
Fantastic. Well, let's go to the next segment. It's the companion adventures. Mine are all story games, so why don't you just do yours?
Okay, let me see. I wanted to try and think of media links to reflect the feeling of the physical places where Thousand Islands are set, and it's really difficult. Not least because most easily accessible Western depictions of Southeast Asia are set during hellish wars, with problematic ethno-social politics. But and it's hard to get, for example, Malaysian or Indonesian films a lot. But one film that did occur to me is this one called Jembatan Pencil, which means pencil bridge, and it's this Indonesian film about a group of kids who they get to go to a free government provided school, which is like set up in their rural area, but because it's such a poor area with limited infrastructure, they have to kind of walk through the forest and over treacherous streams and all this kind of thing to get to and from school. So I thought that it would be a good one to... It's not a great film, to be honest, but it's worth YouTubing just to kind of see I say landscape, that makes it sound grand. It's actually these very tight shots of walking along woodland paths, clambering over rocks, or going out into bays in little fishing skiffs. I think it's good for that. If you imagine the D&D trek through the mountains to the dungeon, some of these journeys are what I think the trek through the jungle to the dungeon in Thousand Islands would look like. And it occurs to me I should spell that title, which is Jembatan. Jembatan, and pencil is as in English, but with an S instead of a C.
I would say we'll have a link in the show notes, but we won't.
No, we won't.
Tell us about your book.
Oh, well, the book has been mentioned before on this podcast, I believe.
Oh, yeah, it has.
Yeah. So, yeah, Creatures of Near Kingdoms is a book written by Zidek, the author of the text bits of Thousand Islands, but with illustrations not by Munkau, but by Sharon Chin. She does these kind of woodcuts. It also has a 50-50 art and text billing. So each double-page spread is an illustration of the fictional, fantastical animal or plant, and then the facing page is a short bit of fiction or like a story or an essay or something about that creature. And they're all things that in a sort of wainscot fantasy modern-day Malaysia might exist, but very probably don't. And I think it's worth reading for more of the feeling of what Southeast Asian-inspired fantasy can be. But in this case, it's more like a Monster of the Week, Urban Shadows, perhaps modern urban fantasy. Definitely worth a look, though.
Yeah, it's a great book, yeah.
And sort of straddling the divide between Creatures of Near Kingdoms and then the more medieval era fantasy of Thousand Islands is Hantu! ! Which is, we nearly put in the intro to this episode because it's a Thousand Islands zine, because you can get it off that itch page, and is exactly the same format, but it is a series of essays and short fiction about hantu, which is supernatural beings that are most often translated as ghosts, but aren't really, from Malaysia and Indonesia and related spots, also by Zidek. And these are all kind of fictional monsters that, I mean, as far as I'm aware, although it's possible, they are not actually descriptions of the monsters that are in legends that people in Southeast Asia actually talk about. But they reflect the tropes of those legends in a way that, like, probably if you were to describe one of them to, say, someone from Indonesia, they would go, "Oh, I haven't heard of that, but that sounds believable." Like, that's something
right,
that you might find in Sumatra one. So, and that's really interesting, and it has some sort of, well, actually, I say they're personal reflections on what it is to think about hantu and so on from Zidek. But of course, he's one of those tricksy creative types, so it might be just a very believable, unreliable narrator. Who can say? But certainly worth a read. I mean, just get the whole set if you're buying the stuff, and hantu is certainly worth a read.
And your music recommendation?
We've had a few episodes that are slightly Southeast Asian, so all the standard gamelan recos apply, especially Javanese and Sundanese, I would say. But also, I was thinking about this, and I think another interesting one to do would be to look up on YouTube the music that's associated with Pencak Silat, the martial arts. So Pencak, P-E-N-C-A-K, Silat, S-I-L-A-T. And then either Bubuka, B-U-B-U-K-A, which is the music they play, kind of the opening before practice sessions or performances begin. I'm being a bit hazy on this because I don't know very much about Pencak Silat. Or Tepak, T-E-P-A-K, which is a term for the different modes. And basically, if you stick those words into YouTube, you'll find some quite endearingly home shop videos. Like the sound and video quality is not that good, but it means that it's, you want authentic music. Authentic music is what people play in their local gymnasium before a martial arts demo, isn't it? And it uses like drums and gongs and shawms, which are the very reedy oboe-like instruments that you find pretty much everywhere around the world, actually. And I don't know the Indonesian word for that instrument either, so let me know if you know.
All of my companion adventures are story games that, in a nod to our expert delve today, feature illustrations or drawings as part of their mechanics. I would direct your attention to Swords Without Master, which is famously available in Worlds Without Master, Volume 3. Swords Without Master is a sort of very rules-light story game that is about like swords and sorcery type, Conan-esque fiction, right? The drawing mechanic is called eidolons, not drawing, more like images that you find on the internet mechanic. Eidolons are essentially, they are pictures that players are encouraged to look up and find before the game starts to represent their character. And so before you play Swords Without Master, you, as a player, go on the internet and find a cool fantasy picture, a character, and you're like, that's my eidolon, that's my character. And then you kind of use that as a springboard for like the way you narrate different things in the game. Another game is Vesna Thoug, which is by Nathan Paoletta. And Vesna Thoug, it takes place in a post-apocalyptic Soviet Union where they play the leaders of these communities, these bunker communities that go out to forage for resources in these gigantic mech things that they have managed to piece together from the junk they find left over from the apocalypse. It's a really cool game because the character sheet has a big blank space for you to draw your mech. And so every player starts by drawing the sort of main corpus of their mech, and then they pass it to the next player, who then draws like, a clawed appendage or a certain type of tire or a rocket launcher or something like that. And then once you get it back, you go and you assign like stats to each of those like little weapons and appendages that were drawn onto your mech. It's a super fun little process. The game Skeletons by Jason Morningstar is a game about skeletons in a crypt, in a classic sort of, fantasy crypt. And the game takes place over the course of centuries. So it has lots of interesting novel mechanics, including the fact that most of it is played in the dark. You just sit in a dark room for a number of minutes, completely silent, as if you were a skeleton waiting for someone to come into the tomb, right? And eventually they do. And at that point, you all gather around a map, a shared map, and you draw elements on the tomb based off like what's happening in the scene when the tomb robbers finally get inside. And you sort of make adjustments after every epoch. And it's a cool game that uses kind of drawing as a means of storytelling. And then we have a very, very deep cut, The Valedictorians Death by Paul Sagat.
Amazingly, I remember this. Yeah.
This is incredibly deep cut. But Valedictorians Death, which I'm pretty sure 3 people in all of existence have played, is an exceptionally cool game in its way. And it is a mystery game about a valedictorian at a high school who died. And you actually use a real-world yearbook, just an old yearbook that someone has on hand, preferably one that is not your own, so that your own picture is not implicated in the story, just some random yearbook.
So it doesn't get weird.
Yeah, that would get really weird. And you use this yearbook as a way of generating NPCs, and it's a pretty cool thing. So those are my recommendations.
Nice.
And listeners, that's our show. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. If you would like to support Fear of a Black Dragon with a little bit of money to help make the show go, you can do that at Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thanks so much.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you to our exemplary editor, Rich Rogers.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Goodbye.
Hi listeners, we want to let you know that Brindlewood Bay is now available on DriveThruRPG. Brindlewood Bay is a role-playing game about a group of elderly women, members of the local Murder Mavens Mystery Book Club, who frequently find themselves investigating and solving real-life murder mysteries. They become increasingly aware that there are supernatural forces that connect the cases they are working on, and in particular, a cult dedicated to the dark, monstrous aspect of the goddess Persephone will come to vex them. Brindlewood Bay is a cozy crime drama mashed up with Lovecraftian horror. It's Murder, She Wrote meets The Shadow over Innsmouth, and we think you're going to love it. Your download from DriveThru includes the rulebook for Brindlewood Bay, including a version for easy booklet printing, play aids such as the character sheet and dark conspiracy sheet, and 5 mysteries: Dad Overboard, All Hallows Scream, The Great Brindlewood Bay Bake Off, Jingle Bell Shock, and A Murder Most Mucky. We'll be releasing 10 more mysteries over the next few months. Some of these mysteries will be featured in the Codex magazine, and others will be part of a standalone mystery collection coming out in late summer 2020. The first of the new mysteries, Exit Stage Death, will be out this month in Codex Yellow 2, available through the Gauntlet Patreon. So be sure to check out Brindlewood Bay on DriveThruRPG. We'll include a link in the show notes. Thanks.